Hello everyone and welcome back to another Commander's Guild Deck Tech with the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have episode number 27 titled Don't Hug the Hippo. And if you haven't seen this before, what we're doing is we are randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a deck around a theme of the chosen card. Now, you may remember last week's episode we actually had a suggested card. This week, we also have another suggested card. So, we didn't randomly pick a card on Scryfall. Instead, we were suggested on Reddit by user dhell, or dehell, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, to use Phelddagrif. Specifically, though, a non-group hug version of Phelddagrif. Hence the name, Don't Hug the Hippo. And so if you don't know, Phelddagrif is 1 white, blue, green for a 4/4 legend. I'm not 100% sure the creature type. And it has pay a white, it gets flying until end of turn, and target opponent gains 2 life. Blue, return Phelddagrif to its owner's hand, and target opponent may draw a card. And green, give Phelddagrif trample until end of turn, and put a Hippo token into play under target opponent's control. That token is a 1/1 green creature. So, alongside Phelddagrif, actually, dhell also requested that we use Nacatl War-Pride and Mirrorweave as other cards of the week. Now, I'm sure they intended these to be separate decks, but I decided to take the challenge and make it all one deck. So for the first time, we actually have 3 random cards of the week. We have Phelddagrif, who's going to be our commander, as we've already mentioned. And then onside that, we have a combo of cards in Nacatl War-Pride, which is 3 green, green, green for a 3/3 cat warrior that must be blocked by exactly 1 creature if able. And whenever it attacks, you put X tokens into play, tapped and attacking, that are copies of Nacatl War-Pride, where X is the number of creatures defending player controls. Remove the tokens from the game at the end of turn. And we'll combo that with Mirrorweave, which is 2 Hybrid Azorius, for an instant that says each other creature becomes a copy of target non-legendary creature until end of turn. So our main goal here is we want to use Phelddagrif to give one of our opponents a ton of Hippo tokens. Try to make sure they have as many creatures on the board as possible. Then we use Nacatl War-Pride to attack, make an additional Nacatl War-Pride for each copy of our opponent's creatures. But the trick is, if we attack with Nacatl War-Pride, and then with the attack trigger on the stack, we cast Mirrorweave and turn Nacatl War-Pride into something else, all of the tokens of Nacatl War-Pride actually enter as copies of whatever we just turned Nacatl War-Pride into. So, for example, if we turn it into a Phelddagrif, all of the tapped and attacking creatures would enter as Phelddagrif. Obviously, not helpful in this case because it's legendary. Mirrorweave doesn't hit legends, but you get the idea. So let's take a quick look at our commander, which I'm sure we've already mentioned is Phelddagrif. But beyond that, we're going to take a look at some themes as well to kind of piece together how this deck is actually supposed to be working. So first off, we have tokens. We want to be able to create as many tokens as possible, especially because Nacatl War-Pride wants us to have tokens. And if we can make a massive board of creatures, we can use Mirrorweave to turn them all into something extremely powerful and just slam into our opponents to win. So Flurry of Wings is green, white, blue for an instant, where we put X 1/1 white bird soldier creature tokens with flying into play, where X is the number of attacking creatures. So if we attack with 20 creatures, we make 20 creatures, or we can use it defensively as well if we are being attacked by our opponents, or if our opponents attack someone else with a ton of creatures. It's an awesome token maker. We're in the colors to use it, so definitely a useful card here. Our next theme is blink effects. We want enter the battlefield triggers to be happening. So Rune of the Hidden Realm is 2 green, white, blue for a 4/4 legendary Rhino soldier with vigilance and trample. And we can pay 2, tap it, and exile another target creature. Then, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So we want to be able to blink something with Rune. So if we had a Nacatl War-Pride, we could potentially save it from a threat, or If we had a massive creature like, say, a Hornet Queen that creates creatures when it enters the battlefield, we can do that over and over and over. So we leaned heavily into tokens and enter the battlefield triggers, as well as blinking our stuff. And as an example of one of our big enter the battlefield creatures, we have Terastodon, 6 green for a 9/9 elephant. When it enters the battlefield, you may destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents. For each permanent put into a graveyard this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. So we can play Terastodon, exile it with Rune, bring it back, and that allows us to destroy a total of 6 non-land permanents. They can be ours if we want to get some more tokens. They can be our opponent's stuff if they got problematic permanents on the board. But either way, these are the things we're trying to do. We're trying to make tokens, trying to have a bunch of enter the battlefield effects, and we want to be blinking our creatures. So with that in mind, let's take a quick look at the main, it says key cards, but the main combo that we want to be doing in this deck. So we've mentioned Nacatl War-Pride, we've mentioned Mirrorweave. So the goal here is that we attack with Nacatl War-Pride. Say our opponent has 5 creatures. We're about to make 5 copies of Nacatl War-Pride. So with that on the stack, we cast Mirrorweave targeting Avenger of Zendikar, which is 5 green for a 5/5. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/1 plant creature token for each land you control. And it has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. So if we're attacking our opponent, they've got 5 creatures, we cast Mirrorweave, we make 5 copies of Avenger of Zendikar on the attack. So even if we only have 6 lands, 7 lands, 7 times 5 is going to give us a massive plant token army. And yeah, the Avengers will go away at the end of turn, but that's still at the end of turn. We can still play a land in our second main phase, put counters on all the plants, and this is the main way we are trying to win the game. If we could get this combo to go off, I would argue that this deck was successful. So that's our main goal. We do, however, have some other cool interactions in this deck. That's not the only way we can win, that's not the only thing we're trying to do, but that is the main goal. We could also use something like Essex Fractal Bloom, which is 4 green-blue. It's a 4/4 fractal with flying, and it says the first time you would create 1 or more tokens during each of your turns, you may instead choose a creature other than Essex Fractal Bloom and create that many tokens that are copies of that creature. And if we combine that with something like Hornet Queen, which is 4 green for a 2/2 insect flying death touch, when Hornet Queen enters the battlefield, you create 4 1/1 green insect creature tokens with flying and death touch. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting interaction because we can cast Hornet Queen with Essex on the board. When Hornet Queen enters the battlefield, the trigger to make the tokens goes on the stack. That then triggers Essex, and instead of making 4 1/1 green insects with flying and death touch, we can make any other creature we want. Hornet Queen is already on the battlefield, so we can choose Hornet Queen with that ability, meaning the 4 additional creatures that come in are all Hornet Queens, who all make an additional 4 1/1s with flying. So in the end, we wind up with 5 2/2 flying death touchers and 16 1/1 flying death touchers. That's an incredibly difficult board for anyone to overcome, and I love this interaction. I'm really hoping that when we get to the game, we're able to pull this off, but definitely a decent backup for our Avenger of Zendikar plan. And our next interaction is between Quandrix Cultivator and Rite of Replication. So Quandrix Cultivator, 1 green, a hybrid Simic, and a blue for a 3/4 turtle druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest or island, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Rite of Replication, a bit of a favorite for this channel at this point, is 2 blue for a sorcery with kicker 5, and you create a token that's a copy of target creature. If this spell was kicked, you create 5 of those tokens instead. So Quandrix Cultivator lets us ramp a little bit in the early game, lets us get some lands on the board. And late game, we're able to cast Rite of Replication. If we make one extra Quandrix Cultivator, that's alright, we get an extra land. But if we can kick it, and we make 5 Quandrix Cultivators, notice on Quandrix Cultivator that it says you put the basic forest or island card into play, you don't put it into play tapped. So if we make 5 Cultivators, we get 5 untapped lands onto the battlefield, allowing us to hopefully cast something else as well, and putting us way ahead of our opponents. And even if, like I said, we only get 1, that's still a pretty decent way to ramp. It still gives us an extra 3-4 on the board. Definitely not a bad idea to cast this, even without the kicker, if you needed to. Okay, so now that we've talked about the deck, let's take a quick look at the price, which right now is sitting at about $99.44 based on TCG mid. And so we are very, very close to our budget limit. And I'll be perfectly honest, the reason we're this close to the budget limit is our commander, Phelddagrif. It's a reserve list card. It's $23, makes up a massive, massive chunk of our budget. However, if you happen to have a Phelddagrif and you want to buy the rest of the deck, that means that the rest of the deck is only about $75 or so. You could also replace Phelddagrif with another Bant commander if you really want to. The main reason he's here is because we want to use his ability to create hippos, and there isn't another great commander for that one. But if you're looking to play this deck, there are ways to drop the price down just a little bit. And so now, with the actual deck tech and the deck price out of the way, we are going to jump into a game. We're going to run this deck up against 3 opponents. In this case, we're going to give this one try. Asmorano Mardica Daistina Kuldakar. I think I got that. For the rest of the video, I will probably just say Asmor, because I guarantee I will mess it up at some point. Lord Windgrace, Svaelin of Sea and Sky. So, Asmor is Shawn's newest deck. He is running this madness, wanting to discard some cards, get some value. Probably going to be discarding cards into madness, so he's still able to cast them. I'm not 100% sure what it's going to do. I'm hoping that we can kind of stay under the radar, because Asmor's last ability there, which says sacrifice 2 foods, target creature deals 6 damage to itself, could be pretty devastating for us in the long run if it kills our Nacatl War-Prides, or it kills our Avenger of Zendikar, or our Phelddagrif, or whatever. Definitely something to keep an eye on. Lord Windgrace is Jason's deck for the week. It's the Jund Planeswalker. His is definitely a lands matter style deck, so he wants to play as many lands as possible. He wants to cycle them in and out of the graveyard, getting tons of value, turning them into creatures, drawing cards off of them, discarding cards, and just hopefully trying to value out his opponents. I'm kind of hoping that he's able to at one point turn all of his lands into creatures, hopefully leave us alive, and then when we attack back with our Nacatl War-Prides, we'll have enough power on board to knock him out. But that might just be the magical Christmas land that I'm hoping for. And finally, we have Bilal's version of Svaelin of Sea and Sky, which is the Merfolk Tribal card. And if I remember correctly, I think Bilal said that it's less Merfolk Tribal and more about Voltron, because Svaelin gets indestructible if you have 2 other Merfolk. So it's an interesting hybrid mix of Merfolk Tribal and Voltron. He wants to kind of suit up Svaelin, do a ton of damage, draw some cards when it attacks. So I'm super interested to see how that goes. That's another deck. I'm hoping he has tons of creatures on board for us, but we'll see how it goes. I think this is definitely going to be a fun game. I'm interested to see what some of these commanders can do, but let me know what you guys think at the end of this. We'll jump into that. Hope it goes well, and I will talk to you guys at the end of the game. At the start of the game, I get to go first, followed by Shawn, Jason, and Bilal. On my first turn, I play a Temple of Enlightenment, scrying 1. Shawn plays a Mountain. Jason plays a Rocky Tar Pit. Bilal plays an Island, casts Ponder, looking at the top 3 cards of his deck, shuffling, and then drawing 1. I play a Krosan Verge, tapped. Shawn plays a Swamp, and then casts Conspiracy Theorist. Jason plays a Woodland Chasm, and then sacrifices Rocky Tar Pit to put Blood Crypt into play tapped. Bilal plays an Island, and then cast River Sneak, which is unblockable and gets +1/+1 for the turn whenever another merfolk comes into play. On my turn, I play an Exotic Orchard. Shawn plays a mountain, and then Mountain cycles Ruin Grinder to put a mountain to his hand, and this also lets him cast his commander, Asmorano Mardica Daistina Kuldakar, putting the Underworld Cookbook to hand. Jason plays a Golgari Rot Farm, returning Blood Crypt to hand, and then at the end of turn he discards a Life from the Loam to hand size. Bilal attacks Jason for 1, and then in his second main phase he casts Chart a Course, drawing 2 cards. He then plays a Myriad Landscape, and at the end of his turn, I sacrifice my Krosan Verge, putting a Prairie Stream and a Forest into play. On my turn, I cast Felidar Retreat, which lets me make a 2/2 cat token or put a 1/1 counter on all of my creatures and give them Vigilance whenever I play a land, and I then play a Selesnya Sanctuary, returning Exotic Orchard to my hand and making a cat token named Albert. Shawn plays a mountain and casts the Underworld Cookbook. He then activates the cookbook to discard a card and make a food token. This allows him to discard and cast Grave Scrabbler for its madness cost, returning Ruin Grinder to his hand. He then attacks me for 3 with his commander, and Bilal for 1 with Conspiracy Theorist, paying 1 on attacks to discard and draw a card. On Jason's turn, instead of drawing, he dredges 3 to put Life from the Loam back into his hand, and he then casts Ramunap Excavator, letting him play lands from his graveyard, and then plays a Mountain Valley from his graveyard. Bilal plays an island, and then sacrifices Myriad Landscape to put 2 islands into play. I cast Kodama's Reach, putting a land into play and 1 to hand. This triggers Retreat, making me a cat token named Celeste, and I then play an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to put a basic land into play. This makes 2 more cats, Timothy and Jerica. Shawn plays a Swamp, and then activates the Underworld Cookbook, making a food, discarding Kitchen Imp, and casting it for its madness cost. He then goes to combat, attacking Bilal for 2, me for 2, and Jason for 3, paying 1 to discard Tempting Witch with Conspiracy Theorist and exiling it with its own ability to be cast later. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Tempting Witch, creating a food token. On Jason's turn, he sacrifices Mountain Valley to put a mountain into play, and then plays a Blood Crypt untapped, paying 2 life. He then casts his commander, Lord Windgrace, and activates Windgrace's +2 ability to discard a Life from the Loam and draw a card. Bilal plays an island, and then casts Black Blade Reforged and Nyx Lotus, which taps equal to his devotion to blue. I replay my Exotic Orchard, triggering the retreat to put a +1/+1 counter on each of my creatures and giving them Vigilance. I then attack Shawn for 6, Lord Windgrace for 3, and Bilal for 3. Shawn decides to block a cat with Grave Scrabbler and Tempting Witch, killing the witch and one of the cats. Then in my second main phase, I cast a Muldrifter to draw 2 cards. Shawn plays a Swamp, and then activates the cookbook, making a food, discarding Ruin Grinder, exiling it with Conspiracy Theorist, and then casting it. He then moves to combat and attacks Lord Windgrace for 5, killing the Planeswalker, and also attacks Bilal for 4. Jason, once again, dredges 3 to put life from the loam back into his hand instead of drawing a card for turn. And then he plays Jund Panorama from the graveyard, and moves to his end step, discarding to hand size, once again discarding life from the loam. Bilal plays an island, and then casts Pongify to turn Asmore into a 3/3 ape token. Before that resolves though, Shawn activates Asmore twice, sacrificing 4 food tokens to kill my Muldrifter and a cat token. Bilal then casts his commander, Svelin of Sea and Sky, and equips her with Black Blade Reforged, giving her +1/+1 for each land he controls. Then at the end of turn, Jason casts a Windgrace's Judgment to destroy the Phelddagrif Retreat, Nyx Lotus, and Conspiracy Theorist. On my turn, I cast Nacatl War-Pride, and with it on the stack, I also cast Double Major to copy it, giving me 2 Nacatl War-Prides, before playing Terramorphic Expanse and sacrificing it to put a forest into play. On Shawn's turn, he activates the Cookbook, discarding a mountain and making a food token, then plays a mountain and casts Obnixilis Reignited. He activates Obnixilis' +1 ability to draw a card and lose a life, before casting Shenanigans to destroy Black Blade Reforged. On Jason's turn, he casts Dryad of the Elysian Grove, allowing him to play an extra land each turn. This, along with the Ramunap Excavator, lets him play a mountain and a mountain valley from his graveyard. He then casts a Springbloom Druid, sacrificing a mountain and putting 2 basic lands into play. On Bilal's turn, he casts Marrow Commerce, which untaps all his merfolk at the end of his turn, and then casts Sword of Sinew and Steel, equipping the sword to Svelin, giving her +2/+2 and protection from red and black. He then attacks Shawn for 5, drawing a card, and destroying Obnixilis and the Ruin Grinder when it deals combat damage. This has us all discarding our hands and drawing 7 new cards. Then at the end of turn, Bilal untaps Svelin thanks to the Marrow Commerce. On my turn, I cast Cloudblazer, gaining 2 life and drawing 2 cards, before casting my commander, Phelddagrif, and playing a forest. Instead of drawing for turn, Shawn dredges 1 to return Shenanigans to his hand, plays a swamp, and then casts a Zombie Infestation, which allows him to discard 2 cards and make a 2/2 zombie token. He then casts Shenanigans to destroy Bilal's Sword of Sinew and Steel, since it gave him protection from Shawn's entire deck. Jason sacrifices Mountain Valley to put a mountain into play, and then casts the Gitrog Monster, letting him play an additional land on his turn and drawing a card whenever a land enters his graveyard. He then plays a mountain from the graveyard, and then plays a snow-covered forest, and then plays a rocky tar pit from the graveyard thanks to his 3 land drops. He then sacrifices Jund Panorama to put a swamp into play, drawing a card with the Gitrog Monster, before casting Mina and Den, giving him another land drop each turn. This lets him play Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it for a basic land and drawing another card. Bilal casts and kicks Tideshaper to turn Rocky Tar Pit into an island, and then attacks Shawn for 4, drawing a card on attacks, and Shawn blocks Svelin with Gravescrabbler, killing the zombie. In Bilal's second main phase, he casts Lightning Greaves and equips them to Svelin. At the end of turn, Marrow Commerce untaps all of Bilal's merfolk, and I activate Phelddagrif to give Jason a 1/1 Hippo token. On my turn, I cast Coiling Oracle, revealing Seaside Citadel when it enters and putting it into play tapped. And I then play an Azorius Chancery, returning a forest to my hand, before casting Quandrix Cultivator, which lets me put an island into play from my library. I follow that up with a Cultivate, putting a land into play tapped and another into my hand as I apparently try to out-ramp Jason's ramp deck. At the end of my turn, Shawn activates his Cookbook, discarding a land and making a food token. Then on his turn, Shawn plays a Swamp, discards 2 cards to make a zombie token, and casts Muck Drub for its madness cost. This then also lets him recast Asmore, and he follows that up by casting a Witch's Oven, which lets him sacrifice a creature to make a food token. And if he sacrifices a creature power 4 or greater, he makes 2 food tokens. Jason sacrifices Rocky Tar Pit in his upkeep, drawing a card with the Gitrog monster, before moving to his main phase and recasting his commander Lord Windgrace. He follows that up with Evolution Sage, which lets him proliferate whenever he plays a land. He's then able to play Terramorphic Expanse from his graveyard 4 times, sacrificing it each time to put a basic into play, drawing 4 cards and proliferating Lord Windgrace 8 times, putting his commander to 13 loyalty. He then activates Lord Windgrace's ultimate ability to destroy the Underworld Cookbook, both Nacatl War-Prides, Cloud Blazer, River Sneak, and Marrow Commerce, as well as create 6 2/2 cat tokens with Forest Walk. Shawn, however, before the cookbook is destroyed, uses it one last time to make a food token. Jason then moves to combat and attacks Bilal for 6, but Bilal blocks with his Tide Shaper. On Bilal's turn, he plays an island and casts Aquatic Incursion, creating 2 1/1 Merfolk tokens with hexproof. He then moves to combat, attacking Jason for 3 with Svalin, drawing a card, and Jason blocks with his Springbloom Druid. At the end of turn, I activate Phelddagrif again, this time giving Shawn a Hippo token. On my turn, I cast Eladamri's Call to search my library for a Timeless Witness, putting it into my hand, before casting the Timeless Witness and returning Nacatl War-Pride to my hand from the graveyard. I then recast Nacatl War-Pride and play a forest and pass. Shawn untaps on his turn and just passes. Jason sacrifices a forest in his upkeep, drawing a card with the Gitrog monster, and then casts Lotus Cobra. Unfortunately for him, Bilal counters it with a Sinister Sabotage Surveilling 1. Jason then casts a Crop Rotation, sacrificing a forest and drawing a card, but Bilal also counters that, this time with a Dispel. Before that can resolve, Shawn decides to activate Asmore, sacrificing 2 food tokens and destroying the Evolution Sage. Undeterred, Jason casts Nissa of Shadowed Bows, but this time, I have the counter, casting Negate. Still not out of Planeswalkers, Jason casts Nissa Vital Force and activates her +1 ability to untap a land and turn it into a 5/5 elemental. He then hits all of his land drops, playing 2 forests, a snow-covered swamp, and a Terramorphic Expanse from the graveyard. He sacrifices the Terramorphic Expanse to put a basic land into play and draw a card. Jason then casts a Wayward Swordtooth, getting yet another land drop for the turn, which lets him replay Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it, getting another basic land, and drawing another card. He follows that up by casting Courser of Crufix, which lets him play with the top card of his deck revealed, play lands from the top of his deck, and gains him 1 life whenever he plays a land. He then activates Windgrace's +2 ability to discard a land and draw 3 cards. Finally, moving to combat, he decides to attack me for 12 with the Forest Walk cats since I can't block. On Bilal's turn, he casts Adaptive Automaton, naming Merfolk, giving his team +1/+1, and then attacks Lord Windgrace for 4, drawing a card and killing the Planeswalker. In his second main phase, he casts Deep Analysis, drawing 2 cards, and then plays an island and casts Mistcaller, which can be sacrificed to exile any non-token creature that would enter the battlefield but wasn't cast. At the end of turn, I give Jason another Hippo with Phelddagrif, trying to load him up with as many creatures as possible. I play an island, and then cast Curiosity Crafter, giving me no maximum hand size and letting me draw a card whenever a token I control deals combat damage to a player. I then attack Jason with Nacatl War-Pride, making 15 copies of it that are also tapped and attacking. Jason blocks and kills 7 of them, including the original, but still takes 27 damage and I draw 9 cards. In my second main phase, I cast Ephemerate to exile the Timeless Witness and return it to play under my control. This lets me put the Nacatl War-Pride back into my hand and recast it. At the end of turn, I exile all the War-Pride tokens, and still at the end of turn, Shawn sacrifices Muckdrub to Witch's Oven, making a food token, before casting Garna the Blood Flame to return Muckdrub to his hand and give all his creatures haste. Finally, he discards 2 cards to make a zombie token and recasts the Muckdrub for its madness cost. On Shawn's turn though, he simply passes again. Jason, in his upkeep, sacrifices a mountain to the Gitrog monster and draws a card. He then ultimates Nissa, killing the Planeswalker, getting an emblem that lets him draw a card whenever he plays a land, plays a Bojuka Bog, exiling my graveyard, drawing a card, gaining a life. He plays a Gruul Turf, gaining a life, drawing a card, and returning Bojuka Bog to his hand. His third land drop is a Forge of Heroes, gaining another life, drawing another card. And then he also plays a Dragon Skull Summit, gaining yet another life, and drawing yet another card. Then he casts Torment of Hailfire for X equals 15, but to save the game, I counter it with an Arcane Denial. In Bilal's upkeep, I draw a card and Jason draws 2, thanks to the Arcane Denial. And Bilal then casts and equips Dowsing Dagger to Svaelin, switching the Lightning Greaves over to the Automaton first, giving the 2 plant tokens to me. He then activates Aquatic Incursion to make Svaelin unblockable, and then re-equips her with the Lightning Greaves before attacking me for 6, drawing a card and transforming the Dowsing Dagger into Lost Veil. At this point, Jason realizes he's dead on my turn, so he decides to concede, removing himself from the game. And at the end of Bilal's turn, I give Shawn 2 more Hippos with Phelddagrif. In my upkeep, Ephemerate's Rebound trigger happens, so I exile Coiling Oracle, returning it to the battlefield. This lets me draw Tristani Triscordant. I then play a Forest, and cast Swords to Plowshares, exiling Asmore and gaining Shawn 3 life. In response, he uses her ability to kill Nacatl War-Pride. I then cast a Wargate for X equals 6, letting me search my library for a creature of 6 mana value or less and put it into play. In response, Bilal casts Insidious Will to copy the spell, putting Kira Great Glass Spinner into play. Then my spell resolves, and I put Essex Fractal Bloom into play. Unfortunately, I had forgotten about Mistcaller, and Bilal sacrifices the Merfolk so that Essex is exiled instead of coming into play. I then follow that up by casting Avenger of Zendikar, making 15 plant tokens, which is the number of lands I control, and this would have been 15 additional Avenger of Zendikars if I had still had Essex. At the end of turn, Shawn sacrifices Squee Goblin Nabob to Witch's Oven, making a food token. Then, in his upkeep, Squee returns to his hand, and Shawn flashes back Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, recasts his commander Asmore, and then activates Witch's Oven to sacrifice a Hippo, making a food token, and then uses the food tokens to kill Avenger of Zendikar with Asmore's ability. Bilal plays an island, and then equips Kira with lightning greaves, twice technically, since her own ability counters it the first time, and then casts Sword of Hearth and Home, paying the equip cost twice so that he's able to equip the sword to Svaelin through Kira's ability, and he then re-equips lightning greaves to his commander before attacking me for 6, drawing a card on attacks. In his second main phase, Bilal casts a Hero's Blade. On my turn, I cast Rite of Replication to copy the Timeless Witness. This lets me return Avenger of Zendikar to my hand, and then I recast Avenger of Zendikar. In response, Bilal attempts to counter it with Reject, but I'm able to pay the 3 mana, allowing the Avenger to resolve. Then, when it enters, I make 15 more plant tokens. I then play a Plains, triggering the Avenger and putting a +1/+1 counter on all of my plant tokens. I then move to combat and attack Bilal for 21 with all of my token creatures that don't have Summoning Sickness. He opts not to block, so I draw 17 cards when they do combat damage. In my second main phase, I cast Flicker Wisp to exile the Avenger of Zendikar and return it to play at the end of turn, making 16 more plant tokens. On Shawn's upkeep, he returns Squee to his hand from the graveyard and then casts it in his main phase. He then casts Feast of Sanity, which does 1 damage to any target when he discards a card and gains him a life. And then he discards 2 cards to make a zombie and drain me for 2. On Bilal's turn, he plays an island, and then moves Lightning Greaves to Kira, casts and equips Umezawa's Jite to Svaelin, paying to equip twice thanks to Kira, and he then moves the Greaves back to his commander. He then goes to combat, attacking me for 6, drawing a card on attacks. I block with the Curiosity Crafter since it's the only thing capable of doing so, thanks to the protection granted by Sword of Hearth and Home. On my turn, I play a Command Tower, putting a 1/1 counter on all of my plants again, and then cast Jazal Goldmane, which can be activated to give my creatures +X/+X, where X is the number of attacking creatures I control. This allows me to give all my creatures +171 power and 171 toughness on attacks, killing both Shawn and Bilal, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a super sweet game. We definitely got to show off some of the power of Phelddagrif in this game. I think all of the commanders and the decks really did what they wanted to do, but it felt like our value of just being able to blink some of our creatures and recur some of our creatures. We cast in Nacatl War-Pride 3 times in that game, so it kept dying, we kept bringing it back, and I think in the end, being able to swing for over 171 damage with each of our creatures was absolutely phenomenal for this deck. I'm super happy with it. We never got Mirrorweave, which is a shame. I would have loved to have turned our little plants into something else, but I think being able to see the value of Nacatl War-Pride, the value of Curiosity Crafter drawing us a bunch of cards was definitely kind of a silent MVP for this game. So, super happy with this deck. I think it turned out really well. I will say that if we had been able to get Essex on board earlier, it might have been a lot more powerful, which is kind of weird to say because it was very strong already, but I would definitely play this deck again in the future. I might keep it together for my own personal use. And other than that, I hope you guys did enjoy the game. If you have any suggestions for future videos or recommendations for specific cards that you would like to see turned into decks and tested out in some gameplay, please do let me know. And as always, please hit that like and subscribe button. It does help to try to grow the channel a little bit. And feel free to follow me on Twitter as well. That's in the description. You can find me over on Reddit. You can send me an email. All of that's in the video description. And feel free to comment any suggestions as well. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.